Okay, and then there's some other issues as well that I'd like to draw your attention to. The first one is that in terms of ELLs and their sort of the problematic aspects of assessment, is that ELLs lack proficiency in the language of the test, right? The test is always going to be given in English. And because ELLs are still trying to learn that language, any test given in that language is, needs to be, the score that comes out of that test needs to be cautiously thought about, right? And the inferences that you make from that test should also be considered very carefully. Test scores are subject to inflation. So as we saw from that excerpt that I just went over, schools have pressure to have high passing rates to meet the criteria of the state and federal accountability programs, and also to get funding that way, right? Their funding is cut when they don't do well, when their students don't do well on the tests. And so the scores are going to inflate because teachers are going to be using sort of questionable strategies to try and get students to do well on the test, right? Teaching to the test. Also, teachers could use questionable strategies when trying to minimize or eliminate the impact of ELL students' test scores. So remember that ELL students have to be included in the testing, and that's a great thing because it does force accountability on the schools. But with so much pressure on the schools to perform well, and there being such a high stakes sort of environment in terms of what happens if students don't do well on the tests, this often leads to questionable strategies of how the teachers and the schools get ELLs ready to take these tests. Okay. There are also some unresolved issues with regards to reliability and the validity of test scores for ELL students. Okay. And we're going to talk about reliability and validity right now. So reliability refers to the degree to which the test consistently measures what it claims to measure, and the validity refers to the degree of accuracy of the test in measuring what it is intended to measure. Okay, so let's talk about reliability first. And there are three types of reliability. The first thing we're going to go over is the internal reliability. But before we do, I want you to think about the concept of reliability, which recognizes that no test is free from error, right? And that these errors result in misrepresenting students' knowledge and ability. So reliability refers to, again, the consistency with which the test measures whatever it's supposed to be measuring. So think of reliability as consistency. And again, there's three types of ways that the test can be consistent. So that first way is internal reliability, which you have to think about. You have to think about how consistently do the test items function. You've likely encountered poorly written or simply bad questions on the test. Questions that even the most prepared students may not be able to answer correctly. Okay, so these items lack consistency with other test items that might be better at gauging the student's knowledge. If there are many poorly written or unfair questions, then the test is going to lack internal reliability. And it's not going to be able to properly distinguish between the higher level and the lower level students, or between students who are well prepared and those who are not, which is the whole point of the test. Okay? So that internal reliability messes with the effectiveness, right, of the test. Okay, the second type of reliability is stability. And here I want you to think about how consistent are the results of a test across different testing occasions. So theoretically, if a teacher gives a test on Monday and then gives the same test on Tuesday and does not provide any additional teaching between those 2 days, then the results should be the same. But there are many factors that can affect the test results. So for example, did the student eat breakfast? Is the student feeling ill or concerned about a problem at home? Did the student see something on television that covered maybe the same topics on the test after school on Monday? So these and other factors, as you can imagine, can introduce some errors of measurement into the test. Okay, and we call these things stability. Okay, and then the third form of reliability is called alternative forms. And think about this as how consistent are two or more different forms of a test. Teachers or testing companies may want more than one form of their test available to prevent cheating, or if a test is reused in the future, to prevent teachers and students from remembering the questions or the answers. So, of course, alternative forms are not identical, right? They can't be, but they are as similar as possible. Now, that as similar as possible is where the possibility of a measurement error is sort of introduced. Okay. So these are the three types of reliability. Okay. And now we're going to go into activity 3. Again, very similar to the other activities we've done in this unit. You can find this again in Blackboard under this unit where you're watching this video. Take a moment to go through these 5 situations and figure out if the following issues that they represent in terms of test reliability is because of internal reliability, stability, or alternative forms of a test. And we'll go over it together in a moment. Okay, so number 1, a test that includes a question that is syntactically ambiguous. Okay, you should have put internal reliability because remember, internal reliability is talking about how the question is written. How well is it written? If a question is ambiguous in any way, then it's not going to do a good job of distinguishing between the high-performing students or the well-prepared students and the students who are not. Okay. Number 2, a test that students seem to do better on when sitting alone in a separate room. Okay. That would represent stability. Remember, stability are outside factors affecting a student's performance on the test. Number 3, a translated test that is lexically and syntactically more difficult than its English equivalent. That would be alternate forms of a test and the reliability that is connected to that alternate form. Number 4, a test that systematically scores minority students lower than other types of students. Internal reliability, okay, so even though this particular example doesn't talk about a question in mind, the fact that minority students are automatically going to be scored lower than other types of students because of their background tells us that the types of questions in the test are not doing a good job of focusing only on how well prepared the student is, right? It should not be influenced at all by the student's experience, by the student's ethnicity, culture, any of those things should not be influencing the score. And if it is, then it's telling you that your test has some internal reliability issues. Okay, number 5. A history test that students as a whole perform much better on after having lived through 9/11. Okay, so this would be stability, because again, that's an outside influence, right? That's something in the environment that changed for the student that allowed them to do better or worse on the test. Okay, so unlike reliability, validity cannot be established through mathematical formulas. Rather, just as, for example, a lawyer gathers evidence to make a legal case, a variety of evidence has to be gathered to make the case for validity. And the evidence that's gathered can be one of the following 3 types. Okay, so we have content-related evidence, which refers to how well the content of the test relates to what is being assessed, right? So, in other words, the extent to which an assessment procedure adequately represents the content of the assessment domain being sampled. So the questions, the observations, is it really valid as a test of whatever you're trying to test? Okay, so here, if you take this example, right? Mrs. Hill bought some foods to make a fruit salad. She spent $15.50 for a bag of apples, $30 for a box of oranges, $27.25 for a bag of tangerines, and $8 on a bag of nuts. She paid the clerk with $100. How much change will Mrs. Hill receive? So this could be invalid. This test, this question, could be invalid if, for example, you are testing spelling, right? It's not really used to measure spelling, right? It tells us something else. Another way in which this could be invalid, thinking about content-related evidence, is that if this question were to be used with an English language learner, then the language that's involved, right? There's a lot of language here. It's a word problem. Could get in the way of having an ELL provide the correct answer. So the ELL might know what to do, right? But in the way that it's presented to the English language learner is not conducive or gets in the way of identifying if the test is assessing addition correctly or a subtraction, right? Okay, criterion-related evidence is the second type of validity, and it refers to the degree to which performance on an assessment procedure accurately predicts a student's performance on an external criterion, right? So we're trying to see if performance on this test predicts performance on something else. And for example, the SAT, right? One of the reasons why institutions have students take the SAT is that it's supposed to predict performance in the first year of college. And so that is the criterion-related evidence. So language proficiency tests are supposed to predict how well a student would perform in a mainstream classroom. And the criterion-related evidence for these tests should be gathered with the data showing that students who score low on the test are going to struggle with the language demands of the mainstream classroom. But those who score high on the test should be able to cope. But this type of data is not collected as often as it could or should be. Okay, and then the last sort of type of validity is construct-related evidence, and this relates to the extent to which the empirical evidence confirms that an inferred construct exists and that a given assessment procedure is measuring that inferred construct accurately. So what we mean is that if we take an area of skill like reading, and we identify that, okay, to be good at reading, you have to be good at spelling, you have to be good at, let's say, phonological awareness, you have to be good at... So, for example, as I was saying, if we've indicated that spelling and phonological awareness are parts of reading, and we're having our test include components that have to do with spelling and phonological awareness, we have to be sure that those things are actually accurate, that there is that reading is based on spelling, it is based on phonological awareness, etc., etc. Okay? So the last point that I'd like to make to you is that ELL's limited English proficiency obviously interferes with validity and the reliability of the test, which obviously can have a serious effect on the student's score and makes sense as to why the scores of students' English tests and even the tests that they do in English that are of other content areas like science and math should be interpreted very, very carefully, right? As I showed you before, a math test with word problems in English for an ELL student is going to be more of an English test than it is of a math test, right? Because of the English barrier. Here's some other issues with assessment that you should keep in mind, right? If the test is timed, the student may not have enough time to finish. The English reading comprehension level of the test may be too difficult, so in that case, that's when the test becomes more a measure of English than of the content area. The education program that the student comes from may have not been that strong, and so the student may be still trying to acclimate themselves to the rigor of the current program that they're in. The teaching quality may be inferior in the same way. So if the teaching is done in English, and the student's English language proficiency is not that good, then there's a question to how much they're actually learning, right? And that was something that the laws tried to rectify, saying that the teaching that is done in English has to be made comprehensible for the students, right? It can't be the same for everyone. Also, if the students live in social cultural isolation, they're likely to underachieve, right? So all of these things present valid threats to the valid interpretation of ELL test scores. Okay, so for activity number 4 on validity, follows very similar to what we've done before. You'll find this activity sheet in the unit that you're watching this video. What I'd like you to do is look at the following 4 issues in test validity and try and figure out if it represents content, construct, or criterion-related evidence. So I'll give you a moment, you can pause the video, and then we'll go over it together. Okay, so let's go over it together. So a multiplication test that includes only numbers multiplied by 10. So if you think about it, when you multiply by 10, you're just adding a 0. So there's really not much math going on, right? Calculations. And so this would be an example of a content validity breach, because what you're actually testing is not the ability to calculate, right? It's more like having seen a pattern. Number 2, a test that states it evaluates students' language proficiency but only includes subtests on listening and reading. This would be construct validity breach, because if we're thinking about a student's language proficiency, there should be at least speaking and writing included in that test, right? So we're saying that the constructs that are included in that test are not sufficient to represent language proficiency in general. Number 3, the math portion of an SAT test used to infer if an English majoring student will be successful in college. This is criterion, right? And this is something we talked about, that example of the SAT test actually being designed to mimic how a student would do in their first year of college. And then last, a spelling test used to measure reading comprehension. This would be a breach of construct validity, because of course a spelling test is very little or just one small component, if any, of reading comprehension.